Internet. Welcome to Chut Chat 5.1. This is a point one because this is going to be another kind of multi-video because it's dealing with another very long document. This one's going to be Mein Kampf, and I'm sure most of you heard of it. Anyone who's unfamiliar, it's the book that Hitler wrote when he was in jail before he was able to start World War II. Let's see. This is my copy. This one was most recently published in 1939, right before Hitler was even out of jail, I think, which is super interesting. And it's annotated by 3 Jewish historians, which is just helpful for context. You know, anytime there's a claim, if it's misinformation, or if, you know, if they just kind of feel like they want to explain what his thought process or sort of who influenced his ideas were, and which is just kind of helpful, again, contextually. I saved this book from a library that was going to get rid of it, and a bunch of other ones years and years ago. I've been carrying it around forever, and I always knew that I wanted to read it, but I wanted to give it the proper attention because it's a 1,000-page long book. It's very, very, very thick and chewy. It's, you know, it's a lot to read through. It is, it's a lot. And so I wanted to give it the proper attention, and only in the past few years have been really compelled to do so, and in a place where I can sit down and focus. It took me about 1.5 years to read or so, because if I wasn't quite grasping it, I would have to put it down and come back to it, because again, I didn't want to leave anything just kind of like skimmed over. And what I started to notice was, you know, at about, you know, halfway through the book, a little bit further, was things started to look very familiar. And it wasn't so much, you know, like comparing Hitler to Trump, which is wildly popular and kind of dumb. But when you look at, like, this becomes a playbook for how to create your own political party. And it shows what he did, how he succeeded, some of the things that, some of the hurdles he faced, and it's just like play by play, who you have to go after, how you go after them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you know, little milestones, you know, he's going to find. And so, you know, a lot of it could have been written about movements that happened in 2015. And so this one will also be kind of the most telling of my, you know, potential political stances, or opinions at least. And the MAGA movement was very similarly created and succeeded in very similar ways that Hitler's Nazi movement did, the party creation, right? And so, you know, and again, I'm just a bartender, but one of the interesting things is I get to keep, you know, hearing what people say over and over. And one of our favorite sayings is, you know, something along the lines of, you know, history repeating itself and we never learn from our mistakes. And those are kind of only partial truths. The people that want to rise to power for whatever reason, whether it's money or notoriety or violence or, you know, sex appeal or attention or whatever it is, right? We'll call them the aspiring autocrats, whatever that means, just blanket term. They keep trying to rise to power, but that's just their nature, right? Saying that a chocoholic is eating another candy bar is not saying that he's repeating history, it's just doing what he does, right? I am a chocoholic, I will continue to go after that candy bar. I'm not repeating history, I just really want chocolate. And so that's not really repeating history, that's just people with autocratic tendencies, whether it's ingrained in them, whether it's social, whether it's genetic, whether it's some kind of pathy, whatever it is, that's just them doing what they're going to do. The repeating history part and the not learning our lessons part comes down to us, right? And so all the aspiring autocrat has to do is lie or cheat or enact violence or spend a ton of money or bribe or make leverage or whatever they can do to try to rise their ranks to the top of whatever, whether it's your local mayor or councilman, whether it's a judge, or whether it's the president of the, a country, prime minister, whatever. All they have to do is focus their energy on just rising those ranks. We, on the other hand, are tasked with being able to recognize these tactics, recognize motives. We have to objectively put aside our social or economic or any other kind of our physical maladies. We have to put aside the things that might let us be clouded by this type of misinformation, these types of tactics, this kind of overzealous promises. We're gonna change everything and make it better again. We have to be able to be like, all right, well, how? Exactly how? And does that even seem feasible? So it's our job to not allow these aspiring autocrats to get these footholds, because most crazy people that try to get to the top, it doesn't work, because it takes a lot of energy, a lot of money, a lot of strength, a lot of moral flexibility to be able to get to the top of a city, let alone an entire country. And that's why, aside from the handful of people that go from the battlefield to the White House or whatever it is far fewer, and most people that end up being leaders of nations are much older because they've been working at it for 40, 50, 60 years. And again, most are seen through because it's just a tricky thing to do. But just like that fascist talk, the Chuck fascist talk, right? Most times this happens, we see through history, is after a nation as a whole goes through some kind of trauma, or whether it goes through some sort of perceived loss or embarrassment or something like that, where a 51% majority of those willing to act, willing to vote, willing to participate, feel slighted and want to find a hero in a person. And very often someone with, we can see heroes in different ways, but sometimes the aspiring autocrats come in and they say, hey, I'll be your hero, And so it's our job to not be so excited about someone saving their country that we get blinded by their rhetoric, right? Even Joseph Stalin back in Russia was like, hey, I'm not going to starve you like the Tsar did, right? I'm going to make things better. And the country was so blinded by how horrible their previous leadership was that they're like, all right, Stalin, you get it, or whatever the example is. I know my history is very spotty. And so so what we're going to do is we're going to go through Mein Kampf. We're going to talk first about early Hitler, because it's good to set up just sort of a base knowledge of him, the man, right? This man wrote this clunker of a book, and it's very revealing. And so what I'm also going to do, just because I think it's really lazy and really counterproductive to compare Trump to Hitler, because people are comparing everyone to Hitler. People compare Hillary Clinton to Hitler, people compare Bernie Sanders to Hitler, and Gavin Newsom to Hitler, and Donald Trump to Hitler, and just everyone's compared to Hitler all the time. And so this first talk is going to be highlighting some of Hitler's ideologies, his youth, his bring up in a very, very sort of condensed way, and then loosely comparing those to Trump, where I think that they're two completely different men. And then later we'll talk about how the MAGA movement and the Nazi movement actually have some very similar, methodologies and stuff, but that's because there's a playbook, right? There's many other playbooks too. There's Mao Zedong's Little Red Book. There's, even The Art of War is a beautiful playbook. It's 2,000 years old or something. very well documented history of religious, political, social entities that gained an immense amount of power and either, did good with it or did bad with it. But there's a lot to draw on for those that are trying to climb the ranks, right? What worked, what didn't work, how did it work, why did it work, what window of opportunity am I looking for to do this perfectly? If that's your goal, then there's a lot of history to be able to help you. But first, we'll talk about Hitler, right? Hitler, like, he grew up a pretty kind of normal poor kid in the Austria-German border region, and his dad was like some kind of legal clerk, so blue collar, but still able to take care of the family. And his dad seemed to support, Adolf in his educational endeavors. Sent him to gymnasium, which is the common school to go to, and then, saw some different talents and interests in Adolf, and sent him to this like other charter school where he could explore his other talents. And this is where Hitler kind of got into drawing and artistry. His first goal, I think he was a choir singer, and so he wanted to be a clergyman when he was very young. But then when he reached about 11, 12, going to this other school, he wanted to be a drawer or a painter. He wanted to be an artist. And his dad wasn't really stoked on that, but he supported him. And so Hitler's father died suddenly. He actually described it quite beautifully. But I think he had an aneurysm or something like that, and he died when Hitler was 13, which left him and his mother to fend for themselves. And it sounded like his mom tried really hard to keep things normal as long as she could, but then, fell ill, fell weak, and passed only a handful of years later, leaving Hitler with absolutely nothing and basically absolutely alone, which is one of our first differences, right? Donald Trump had his parents throughout his whole life, and was really, really tailored in these very specific, successful ways, whether it was social movements. His father was big in social movements, arrested at a Nazi rally, actually, I think in the 60s, and also a real estate tycoon, right? So he was kind of given this path to success that his father had already paved out for him, as well as roughly $400 million in the 80s, which is absolutely insane. A bunch of, buildings to rent. So he had everything handed to him. Very much different than Hitler. And I mean, just two total opposites when it comes to an origin story, right? And let's see, originally we went to that, but all right, so Hitler was kind of on his own and still focused on going to school. He wanted to be an architect, which I guess was probably the most natural and professional avenue to take if you wanted to pursue art, drawing, and started getting less interested and less positive responses to his art, but got really into history and politics, these other courses that he was taking in order to fulfill a degree, and even spoke very highly of this one professor that understood very well, or at least Adolf describes him, that he understood very well and was able to convey the importance of oration and reading properly. And the way that Hitler describes it in the book is he says that the way that you read, the way that you listen or take in any kind of anything, right, is you take in and remember and internalize the important stuff, and then it's important to get rid of anything that just fluff, right? Anything that has no meaning or anything that is like a baseless, claim or accusation or whatever, just get rid of that, but hold on to the important stuff. And this is when he learned you know, the power of oration and influence, of public speaking and influence. And when he started to realize that if he was going to make the greatest amount of impact, the way that you do that is everything you say has to be impactful. You can have a whole bunch of fluff, and there's a lot in here. He takes a long time to make a point, but throughout there are very memorable other points, and then his point is extremely strongly made, and so this just turned him into what we call the good speaker, right? And this started in his early 20s when he started to break away from the art stuff and get into the history and politics stuff. You know, we can even see how Trump tries to mirror that, but also a lot of what he says is totally pointless. So he's got kind of a dual methodology where he tries to make everything super impactful, but it's also extremely vague. Everything he says, or like every, you know, timeline is within 2 weeks. He always says, "Oh yes, you know, it was very good. It was very good. It was the best ever." You know, not going into any great detail for two reasons. One is it just leaves you with the impression that it's good, and two, there's a good chance that he doesn't really know what he's doing or talking about or what happened anyway. Let's see. World War I started, and Hitler joined the military. Fought for his country. Was very, very like nationalistic. He became a nationalist when he was studying history and politics, and this drove him to, you know, wanted to join the fight for his country, and was even recognized, I think, a little bit of valor for, you know, fighting the war. But when he came back from the war, he was not well received the way that he and his fellow soldiers thought that they would be. They thought that they would be seen as heroes. They were not. They lost the war. And he also was displeased with the changes that he saw in German society when he returned, right? He was fighting for everything that he knew to be his Germany, and came back to something that looked different, looked more morally depraved or loose, politically degraded. You know, things were more corrupt. He can kind of like took off the rose-colored lens, and he was seeing things in society that he didn't like. And this led him to try to figure out what the problem was and then root it out. But just to go back a little bit, this is another huge difference, right? Whereas Adolf Hitler joined the war to protect the country he very, very much loved throughout. In the same way that JFK's father used his power to get JFK into the war, Donald Trump's father, Fred, used his sway to keep Donald out of the draft. He helped him dodge the draft 2 or 3 times with the excuse of bone spurs in his, bad feet or whatever, which has, never come up again in all his golf years or whatever. And I think that was a pretty common one. There are probably 3 or 4 very, very common flat feet, which is probably harder to prove. But if you had a doctor you could have, then you could, get yourself out of the draft. And this is something that Hitler would have absolutely despised. He would have had zero respect for this person, A, lying, B, using their wealth and leverage and position to get out of something so important, and C, for not standing up for his country. Let's see. So, just, more and more sort of things that are, separations. It starts off at young age, and then 20-year-old Hitler and Trump, and they just couldn't be different people. At one point in the book, and I'll find it later, but Hitler starts describing what he sees as a successful nation, and he has this little paragraph that is basically about once a nation starts placing the value of the dollar over the value of the individual in the nation, a member of the country, a countryman, then that nation has started to fail or has already failed. And so this is one of his big critiques on like Western capitalism. So much of what we were doing, we didn't have great worker rights. We didn't have great like health benefits. The wage discrepancy was very big then. The corporations were using people of its own country in dangerous ways and underpaying them so that they could make a greater profit. And Hitler found this kind of shallow and baseless and not a sustainable way to run a country, not a healthy country or a successful country. And this is kind of, again, the entire opposite. Like Trump, he worships the dollar. He worships some other things too. He likes the attention, loves the attention, but primarily, well, maybe both at the same time, right? But these things that Hitler would have found gross and very American, Donald Trump kind of very much embodies, and that's not any kind of secret. We know that he values the dollar. We know that he values attention. We know that he respects people with more money and more fame and more power than him. It's not something he tries to hide. It's just something that I'm pointing out because Hitler would not have been a fan. To continue that, like Hitler kind of showed his great understanding of economics as well as everything. Or not everything, but he just had, things that he endeavored in, he read very deeply, and he had a good memory, and he understood very well, and probably had a bunch of smart people around him at a certain point too. One of the things that I had read about a while ago that I thought was terrifying and really impressive was one of his plans towards the end of the war was to make counterfeit US dollars and English pounds, and so he either hired or kidnapped or whatever one of the greatest, when they used to chisel out the dollar plates in metal, and that's what they used to print. He found one of the best one of those in the world and had him make counterfeit dollar bills and then English pounds, and the whole idea was he was going to print off millions or billions of these things, flood the economy, induce hyperinflation and tank them, which is really, it might be obvious to those who do understand economics really well, especially in like a wartime situation, but the genius is I don't think that any economy would ever suspect people giving them more money in order to break their economy. It's something that wouldn't have occurred to me, and it just kind of goes to show that between who Hitler had around him or just his own relative understanding of economics was a little bit more vast, a little bit more in depth than the average Joe. Whereas on the flip side, Donald Trump literally only just learned what tariffs were. He was misrepresenting what they were and how they worked during his entire candidacy. And then he had months and months and months for people to explain to him what they were and how they worked. And then he sort of found a way to use them anyway for like leverage, for, bargaining and this and that. But just he's never had to understand economics. He's gone bankrupt 6 times, but never went broke. He's had over a dozen, maybe dozens of businesses fail miserably, up to and including, a casino that was already successful. He's just some Jersey Shore kid that doesn't really have to, never had to understand anything for himself. And so his understanding of a lot of stuff is really just, as thin as it can be. A few other small points. Hitler had very strong opinions about personal health. He himself was famously a vegetarian. When he came back from the military and saw the direction that the schools were going, he was unimpressed with the nation's lack of focus on physical health in terms of eating the right food and physical exercise. And so his military and his Hitler Youth all had very specific dietary sort of restrictions, as well as a lot of physical, like regimented exercise. He believed that eating the right food and having, again, regimented is a big one for him. Regimented exercise, like routine, would obviously create the most physically peak population it could, but also that in the individual, if you treat your body as best it can, then that will help your mind work the best it can too. So he incorporated all these things. He said, look, if you're not eating well and you're not exercising, you're not going to be able to think at full capacity in the best way. And so he was very, very physical health oriented. Another small difference, right? We have Donald Trump, who is an obese man, and no shade to like overweight, but this is where Joe Rogan and I would probably slightly disagree, where, if I were to interview Trump, the first question I would ask him would not be, well, how do you stay in such good shape? If I were to interview Joe Biden, my first question would be like, how do you have such a good memory all the time? It's just, there's no reason to pretend that things are what they are, but Donald Trump he has like a 12 to 18 pack of Diet Coke every day. He's, shameless about loving fast food. And again, these aren't things that anyone around him tries to hide. He got, Rob Kennedy or whatever to eat McDonald's on his super jet. It's embarrassing. And again, like whatever, he's got the best doctors in the world, so it probably doesn't matter that much. But it's just another difference, right? Everything about Hitler's physical life is the exact opposite of everything about Donald Trump's physical life. And go on, Hitler also had very strong opinions about the arts. When he came, he studied the arts, he wanted to be an artist, he loved music, he loved going to plays. He would obviously go to galleries all the time because he wanted to be in this art world. And the sort of post-war Germany, similar to post-Vietnam United States, I bet a lot of the traditionalists and the, classical folks or whatever saw, the sex and the drugs, and they saw it as moral degradation. And Hitler also saw the quality of art and the quality of morals kind of what he considered going down the tubes because of whatever reasons. And, he obviously found scapegoats for all of these things, right? He knew that there were outside influences trying to poison the German people. But he, was less impressed with the music, less impressed with the stage, less impressed with what was going on in the galleries. And so when he came to power, he started to flush his Germany of all of what he saw as tasteless art, and bring back the classical architecture and painting and music and this and that, and also kind of got really obsessed with film, towards the middle end of the war. He tried to compete with Hollywood unsuccessfully, but had extremely rigid standards for what German film could be represented as. And there are probably only a handful of German filmmakers during Nazi Germany for a number of reasons, but one was because Hitler was, he was a very controlling producer. Whereas, on the flip side, we see, Trump made a good portion of his, money most recently from reality television, which is like, on the scale of class, probably even lower quality than soap operas. Those soap operas up here, because at least that has a story and acting, it has this stuff. But again, just completely another difference. So between personal health, between ideologies, Hitler was a very religiously sound person, grew up, at some point said I'm doing God's work. believe that what he was doing, and this, his delusion of grandeur, his pathy, his mental illness or whatever, because he was obviously a genocidal psychopath, but he truly believed that he was doing the right thing, whereas juxtaposed against that, we have Donald Trump that knows he's doing the wrong thing, but is doing it for the specific goal of getting money and power. And so when we try and compare the two, it's kind of a silly endeavor, but it is important to realize that Donald Trump has, and many of them do. I mean, we're seeing them pop up all the time. It's really interesting. All over the world, we're seeing these aspiring autocrats trying to, pop up in South American countries that might not be super stable, trying to hold on to their power. We have, Viktor Orban that's won a ridiculous amount of, elections in a row, and all completely rigged. We have Vladimir Putin, who's won with an 88% approval. We have, and so it doesn't matter so much if they are similar in personality and in ideology, but what we're looking for, what we are tasked to look for, is someone who is seeking power for the wrong reasons, right? Because the dangerous thing is you can seek power for the right reasons and mishandle it. You can seek power for the wrong reasons, but actually become a good leader. But what you don't want is to let someone take this very fragile thing that is our society and mishandle it and hurt it and abuse it and turn it into something bad. Just like democracies in Western nations, whenever we see a country struggling, and we're the world police, and people have very different opinions on that. We can even say we as in democracies. Europe will do it, Asia will do it, South America will do it, Canada will do it. They go and try to help what we see as allies. And in terms of allies, there's kind of like, two splits in the world. There's, democracies, and there's the old autocracies. And so whenever, one of the nations that we get along with, that we trade with, that we appreciate their politics with, we help them out. We try to help them out so that we can preserve their democracy. At the very same token, right, Vladimir Putin and General Xi and Kim Jong-un and, all these other countries, we have, Chechnya and Belarus and all these other places, that when they see one of their countries, whether it's Syria, whether it's Palestine, whether it's Iran, and whether or not they're implicitly friends with them, but because they have the same enemies, they are allied. That's just how it works, So autocracies are trying to help out other smaller autocracies just the same way that we try to help other democracies. And on top of that, we, democracies love to see, we tried so hard to get Castro out so that we could turn Cuba into a democracy. We love to see regime change. We love to see a small extremist group get replaced by parliament or prime minister or a president or something that you can vote for, and then create a judicial system, create a senate, and create these rules and laws and build up your economy and have social programs and stuff like that, right? The same way autocracies would love to see a very fragile democracy crumble and then have a dictator come and take over and then change that into an ally. So how great would it be if, we would be stoked if we could replace Russia with some kind of normal Western president. They would be stoked if they could replace our leadership with something that would be more similar to, aligned with their agenda, their methodology, their social, political, economic preferences, right? And at the very least, get someone in that could fracture the foundational structures of our democracy just enough to weaken us. If we've been the standing guardian for so long, for us to have to go on our knees for any short amount of time would be extremely, extremely handy. And so again, just going back, comparing Hitler and Trump is stupid. It's pointless. Everything you say after that, no one wants to listen to. It's lazy. It's not backed up by any kind of fact. And this is not pro-Hitler propaganda, right? This is just the differences of them. The fact of the matter is the men were both very different, but their methodology of power grab is extremely similar. And the reason it's similar is because Hitler showed us how to do it. He wrote down what he did and what he needed, like I said, all this stuff. And so now, not just Trump, but everyone has all these playbooks. You know, Vladimir Putin has his own playbook. You know, General Xi has his own playbook. The Kim Jong-un's whole family probably has decades of playbook. You know, what works, what doesn't work, who's enemies, who's friends, who can we kind of manipulate, how can we whatever, blah, blah, blah. And so what we're looking for is that end goal, right? What is the end goal? You know, because most Western democracies, their end goal is to have a living, breathing, documented government that evolves with its people as its people evolves and as everything else kind of changes, and to be able to take care of everyone when things kind of go awry, and then be able to raise everyone up when things get better. You know, but other people have very, very different goals. People that are power oriented have an ultimate power goal. You know, very rarely do we have a Castro that's like, I have this country, I'm good. You know, more often it's someone like Vladimir Putin that's like, I'm the richest man in the world, I run this country, I won't ever lose power. That's not enough. That's not enough. And so, you know, it just behooves us to, you know, because we're the ones that repeat the history. So it behooves us to understand what the history looks like and, you know, put that on top of what's happening now and see if there are similarities. Because if there are, then we might have a glimpse of what could happen. You know, and if we're happy with that, if that's the goal that we want, then we can support it. But if it's something that we don't want, we need to change ourselves. We are the consumers, right? We get to tell the small amount of people that are producing what we see, what we eat, what we hear, what we vote for, what we do, what we want. There's 350 million of us. There's about, you know, a handful, 1,000 of them. You know, and it's up to us to give them the power to do what they want to do, or to say, no, you're not what we're looking for right now. And then again, later on, we'll look at, you know, I have to go through and write some better notes on exactly how MAGA and the, you know, NGSWP did come, like, in a very similar way. And, you know, hopefully, if you're a MAGA person, you know, you probably have already turned this off, but, you know, see if what I say, especially for the next one, like, rings any bells. It should be a little alarming. And again, if that's what you're looking for, go for it. But if, you know, something kind of gives a little red flag in your mind, you're like, oh shoot, that did kind of happen, I didn't really see that happen, well, maybe it's something to look into. And it's been long enough, so right now I think that's all I got. Thanks.